It's Monday, the 2nd of April, 2012, and I'm sitting at a Pete's Coffee Shop in Marina del Rey, California, talking to Gerald Pear, former lead designer for FlatWorld, a flagship project from 2001 to 2007 of the University of Southern California's Institute for Creative Technologies, or ICT. In his book Virtuous War, political theorist James Derderian identifies the ICT's opening in 1999 as a founding moment in the emergence of what he names the Military Industrial Media Entertainment Network. Explicitly committed to strengthening the synergies of the entertainment and defense industries, the U.S. Army allocated $45 million for the creation of a research laboratory dedicated to the development of advanced simulations. The rationale for these investments was set out by retired Air Force Colonel Jack Thorpe, hired by the ICT at its founding. In an early concept paper, Thorpe introduces the idea of, quote, exploiting emerging technologies from theatrical set design to improve the fabrication of mock-ups for planning and rehearsing military operations in close-quarter spaces. As described by historians Timothy Lenoir and Henry Lowood in their paper Theaters of War, quote, at the opening ceremonies of the ICT, Richard Lindheim, the executive director, outlined several projects the Institute would be pursuing. Among those he described was a construction of what he referred to as the holodeck. The idea, Lindheim explained, is, quote, to leverage new media technologies of virtual reality to link immersive virtual environments with interactive synthetic agents that are elements of simulation and game-based learning exercises. As a first instantiation of the holodeck, a single-room FlatWorld prototype was demonstrated in November of 2001 in a warehouse space near the ICT in Marina del Rey, with physical walls and props created by Paramount Studios, with assistance from Herman Zimmerman, production designer for Star Trek: The Next Generation. As Lenoir and Lowood observe, the relationship between military simulation and commercial entertainment has a long history. The dramaturgical figuration of warfighting can be traced back to the trope theater of operations, defined by Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz in his book on military strategy, published in 1832. It was in the early 1880s that Major W.R. Livermore of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers imported gaming from the Prussian military as a method of officer training. More recently, the relationship of gaming and training has become further entangled through the incorporation of digital media into commercial game design, Hollywood film production, and warfighting itself. In 1992, STRICOM, the Army's Simulation, Training, and Instrumentation Command, was established under the banner, All But War is Simulation. So how might we think about immersive military training simulations like FlatWorld within the frame of our event this evening? We can start with the invitation from the organizers to consider the technosphere not in the abstract, but in terms of concrete actors. We can take that a step further and think of actors not only as individual, typically human entities, but rather as what in science and technology studies are conceptualized as conjoinings of the social and the technical, persons and things. Agencies or capacities for action on this view are not inherent properties of entities, whether biological or artifactual, but rather are relational effects of particular socio-technical configurations. So it's in this sense that we can think of FlatWorld in its conjoinings of bodies and technologies as an actor in the technosphere, and ask what is it that informs this configuration, and what are the effects that it generates. More specifically, in relation to the theme of this panel, we might think about military training as a kind of anticipatory trauma, a project to enact prospective injury in order to differentially inflict it or avoid it. This project is part of a long-standing dream of managing the inherent contradiction between military rationalities, including the soldier figured as part of the machine, and the deeply affective effects of military operations and their inevitable injuries to self and to others. The promise of training generally, and simulation more particularly, is to constitute the theater of operations as containable and controllable. In the case of FlatWorld, simulation shifts from live exercises to the technosphere of the mixed reality, immersive virtual environment. The further promise of the latter is its reprogrammability, as theaters of operation shift and multiply. But back in this coffee shop down the road from the ICT in 2012, Gerald Pear and I have spent the last hour discussing the life of the FlatWorld project over the 7 years of its existence. By the project's end, large digital flats running real-time computer graphics were augmented by physical props that act as portals into the virtual world. So a physical door leads out onto a virtual city square, along with sensory effects cued to relevant events. So tactile floor speakers simulate the floor flashes and vibrations of explosions. And where would the documentation of the project be now, I ask? Well, I suppose I have most of it, he replies, and then generously offers to make it available to me. 4 months later, he sends me the link to over 1,000 files that he's drawn together, tracing the FlatWorld project from its early conception to its last implementations. It's this fortuitous archive that comprises my current research site. In exploring the archival remains of FlatWorld, my aim is to attend critically to the imaginaries that are realized in the simulation's figurations of places and of raced and gendered bodies, as well as through its storylines. This is part of a wider project of understanding how distinctions between the real and the virtual are elided in technoscientific military discourses, in the interest of recovering differences that matter. I take as a central commitment the recommendation of media theorist W.J.T. Mitchell in his book, Cloning Terror. He writes, quote, "It is never enough simply to point out the error in a metaphor or the lack of reality in an image. It is equally important to trace the process by which the metaphoric becomes literal and the image becomes actual. We need a method that recognizes and embraces both the unreality of images and their operational reality." It was at the Army Science Conference in November of 2006 that a contractor for the Office of Naval Research came by the ICT booth and mentioned that the Marines were interested in using the FlatWorld concept in a project that would become known as the Infantry Immersion Trainer. Aimed at pre-deployment training for the U.S. Marine Corps, the imagined geographies of the IIT were figured around locations of U.S. military operations at the time. More specifically, an Office of Naval Research report positions the Infantry Immersion Trainer as a response to the call for, quote, "an advanced training system that offers Marines an opportunity to become immersed in an Iraqi village without ever leaving U.S. soil." The IIT facility was subsequently built in a large abandoned tomato factory at Camp Pendleton in California. Figured into the simulation, actual humans, recognizable as Middle Eastern, join with virtual characters to enhance believability. In the words of the designers, quote, "The warehouse comes alive as a mini town direct from Iraq. From the sights to the smells to the faces, the Marines will enter a world that will introduce them to what they will encounter when deployed," end quote. First used by the Marines for training in November of 2007, the press were invited to embed with the Marines in a demonstration training exercise in 2008. So let's take a look at that clip now.
Contact front, all right.
Okay, check. Clear.
What do you see? Left side.
Nothing. Right side clear.
Clear. Everything clear.
Gonna go out. Clear.
Everything clear. Everything clear.
Third man coming out. Two men coming out.
One man coming out.
So what's that there? That's the actual avatar room that you guys are just in. So I have a camera that's sitting outside, Can you see when they're inside it too?
Yeah, inside of the room itself is situated on this screen.
I missed it. So what just happened there? They shot that guy, but he didn't die?
Yeah, if you shoot him in anywhere aside from the spinal column, the heart, or the head, then it'll take several shots to take him down.
And how did it figure out where they were shooting?
Inside of that room, thermal camera takes an initial snapshot of the screen itself, so any change in temperature that the actual bullet hits the screen, that change in temperature signifies a shot.
And you've got training running every weekday?
Practically almost every day.
We describe what we're doing here as mixed reality, live role players with the pyrotechnics. Along with the virtual displays. This was in preparation for the confusion, the chaos that a Marine soldier is going to see on his first firefight. We want to inoculate the Marine with the sight, sound, smells, and chaos of close quarters battle so that his first firefight or his next firefight is no worse than his last simulation.
If there is a specific scenario that a platoon commander wants, we can build that in on the fly for them. That's why our facility is so unique, is because we can tailor a lot of the things we do here specifically to the needs of every unit.
Oh! They shot the woman. Was this a good one, what just happened?
No, because they hit an innocent civilian. They'll debrief the points and say that they need to make sure that they have proper target identification.
Chaotic, right? Did we know what blew us up, by the way? RPG. Okay, that didn't blow us up. It was a 155 shell, gents. It's only about this big and about that big around that was sitting right there on the ground. First fire team went right by it. That means we're not paying attention to our surroundings.
Next four up.
We're in there full gear and everything, and a face mask, and you come out, you're just drenched in sweat, and you're still kind of pumped up from it and everything. You're ready to go through it again.
We were clearing some rooms over there about an hour ago, and my heart was probably beating for about a half hour after that. It's no joke.
Yeah. Line up.
Really, for the urban combat, this is pretty much as real as it gets, without actually having people shoot real rounds at you.
Where's my fire team?
Really glad that we actually have this here.
It's way different than a video game.
There is like no way that you can even compare.
don't
You
get
can sit
extra
there and do it on a
lives.
screen, but as soon as like you're no kicking the door in, and all four of you rushing in, like
And another thing, in a video game,
it's not even the same.
you can do it over and over and over again until you get it
Until
right.
you get it right.
Ultimately, you know, like nobody's gonna shoot back at you in there.
I got a woman to the left.
Contact front.
We're doing multiple scenarios to demand that the Marines make the proper moral, ethical, and legal decisions. So we pop up women and children, the innocents, mixed in with the insurgents that these guys are most likely to fight.
I accidentally shot a civilian. Apparently he was standing a little bit too close to the insurgent and shooting with my left hand, so it was a mistake. I'm glad it just happened on the screen and it really didn't happen in real life.
Hey, next door, let's go.
Hey, cousin Matt.
As the film opens, we're following a squadron of Marines in close formation, running past the camera along a narrow street, each with a hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him. So we see immediately a unit of connected bodies in close quarters, moving with a sense of readiness that signals their anticipation of danger ahead. The danger is suggested not only by the orientation and motion of the bodies, but also by the soundtrack of calls to prayer, by now the iconic audio signature of the Islamic Other for Western audiences. Arriving at a closed door, we hear the command, "Get that door down," followed by the crack of a blow as the door falls open onto the interior of a room, revealing a bed and wall tapestry. The unit pours into the room, guns drawn to face another wall out of our view. We hear a hail of bullets aimed at the hidden side of the room. The soldiers turn in all directions and then call, "Clear!" As the camera pans, we see somewhat discordantly, not a bloody corpse, but a bullet-ridden wall on which a virtual character, a woman, mechanically shifts her gaze from side to side. Who is she, we're left to wonder? Who was the target of this shooting? And where is the trauma that must follow an invasion of alien bodies and a blast of bullets into this intimate domestic space? We don't dwell on these questions, however, but cut to a title that tells us where we are. That is, this is Camp Pendleton in California, and we're witnessing the U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Immersion Trainer. Cut back to an image of the opening scene, this time through a black and white video monitor, as we hear Douglas Rushkoff, the series correspondent, ask, "So what's that there?" We're now behind the scene in a control room filled with monitors and programmers' interfaces. One of those shows an image of a virtual, keffiyeh-scarved gunman and a young boy. Full of elisions between real and virtual bodies, the operator explains that the rooms are instrumented with thermal cameras to register the bullet's impact on the projection screen. So if a virtual character is shot anywhere, and here he gestures to his own body, but in the heart, the spinal column, or the head, it might take several shots to take them down. Cut to a full-screen view of the bullet-ridden wall that we've seen before, but this time beside the woman we see two gunmen and watch as they first turn their guns in our direction, then fall below the bottom of the frame in a hail of bullets. A repetition of the opening scene, we assume, this time revealing the enemy that the house raid anticipated. We should mind the edits here and the gaps, however, as presumably bleeding, dying bodies disappear below the frame, and continuities and coherences are intimated that belie the inevitable fragility of both the prototype technology and the careful stagings of its documentary representation. Now we're in a room of actual human role players. We see the man dressed in traditional dress on the left shake hands with the Marine passing by on the right. An explosion rings out and the role players duck for cover. As we hear a voiceover, we describe what we're doing here as mixed reality, live role players with pyrotechnics. Cut to a location just outside the facility, where with a group of soldiers in the background, Tom Buscemi, director of the center, offers what sounds like a highly scripted and remarkably affectless account of what we have seen. Quote, "This was in preparation for the confusion, the chaos that a Marine is going to see on his first firefight. We want to inoculate the Marines with the sights, sounds, smells, and chaos of close quarters battle, so that his first firefight or his next firefight is no worse than his last simulation." Another cut to a programmer's interface and a drop-down menu from which a selection is made. Producing a stereotypic figure of a virtual suicide bomber strapped with explosives, we hear the voice of the operator who explains that the uniqueness of the facility comes from the ability to tailor scenarios specifically to the needs of a particular unit. Cut again to an actual interior, presumably the debriefing room, where a group of Marines are gathered as an instructor enters and says, "Chaotic, right? Do we know what blew us up, by the way?" As the camera shifts to anxious faces, one soldier offers an RPG. The debriefer explains that it was rather a 155 shell sitting unnoticed on the ground. First fire team went right by it, he points out, because we're not paying attention to our surroundings. We get some sense here of the real affective agencies that run through this pedagogy, including the call to demonstrate competency and the shame and real stakes of failure. We emerge from the facility through a door marked authorized access only into the bright sunshine of the California desert, where soldiers testify to the realness of their affected bodies, sweating skin, pumping hearts, while also expressing appreciation for the simulation's virtuality. We're back inside in another exercise, this one involving 3 virtual characters, man, woman, and child. We hear a round of gunfire as the characters fall, then cut to director Buscemi, who explains, "We're doing multiple scenarios to demand that the Marines make the proper moral, ethical, and legal decisions. So we pop up women and children, the innocents, mixed in with the insurgents that these guys are most likely to find." The camera cuts back to Private First Class Vina, who confesses, "I actually shot a civilian. Apparently she was standing a little too close to the insurgent, and I was shooting with my left hand, so," small, embarrassed laughed, "it was a mistake. I'm just glad it happened on the screen, and it really didn't happen in real life." The screen fades out as another unit are shown entering the facility, and we have a title explaining that the Marines we have just met are scheduled to deploy to Afghanistan later in the year. The difference between the Iraqi sonography that we just witnessed and the premise of this as an anticipatory immersion in an Afghan theater of operations is left unremarked. So what of events in actual sites of combat during this period? Writing in the International Journal of Feminist Politics, Thomas Gregory recounts the United Nations Assistance Mission report of an incident in Afghanistan in the summer of 2008, in which approximately 90 civilians, including 60 children, were killed. The scenario could read like something out of the IIT, quote, according to reports, US forces and Afghan military personnel entered the area on the night of 21 August in order to capture a local Taliban commander. During the course of their operations, the soldiers encountered enemy fighters, prompting them to request additional air support, end quote. Initially claiming only 5 civilians killed and blaming the reports of large civilian casualties on the Taliban, the US military were forced to reopen their investigation following the release of mobile phone footage and eyewitness reports. Judith Butler has countered the premise of virtuous war perhaps more radically than anyone in her book Frames of War. Challenging the historically precedent and more fundamental premise of a legal framework regulating warfare, she writes, quote, the international law that prohibits crimes against civilians presupposes that there can be a war without such crimes, reproducing the idea of a clean war whose destruction has perfect aim. But if there is no stable way to distinguish permissible collateral damage from the destruction of civilian life, then such crimes are inevitable, and there is no non-criminal war. This possibility contextualizes immersive simulation within the wider question that frames my project. If trauma refers to the ongoing or repeated effects of a wound suffered in the past, my contribution to our panel shifts the frame to an anticipated future. More specifically, it looks at preparations for warfighting, particularly military training, as a kind of anticipatory trauma, based on the promise that by acting out the site of potential wounding in advance, one might be able to avoid subsequent injury. A central problem that joins my own interests with those of my research subjects is the military concept of situational awareness, and more specifically, the requirements of positive identification and imminent threat that underwrite the canons of legal killing. I'm thinking about the trope of situational awareness through related questions of intelligibility and identification, and more particularly through a frame inspired by Judith Butler's theoretical analysis of recognition's generative agencies. In Bodies That Matter, Butler suggests that the intelligibility of the body includes always its constitutive outsides, those unthinkable and unlivable bodies that, as she says, do not matter in the same way. Bodies that do not matter in the same way takes on further resonance in the context of simulation, as another sense of bodies differently materialized. So I close with a question that sets up my research agenda. How can we think simulation and actuality together through their resemblances, their real corporeal connections, and articulate their crucial differences, particularly when it comes to acts of wounding and killing? What does it mean to be at once immersed in a world, but at the same time not of it? And what are the leaky boundaries that undo the carefully crafted lines of connection and separation meant to keep our bodies safe and to maintain the difference between those of us who are addressed by the simulation and those figured as its objects? Military training in situational awareness develops on a premise of recognition of that which is already there, already a threat or not one. But if we think of the division friend-enemy in the way that Judith Butler first urged us to think of binary sex, both need to be understood as part of regulatory practices that produce the bodies that those same practices are designed to govern. On this analysis, like binary sex, friend-enemy is, in Butler's words, quote, an ideal construct which is forcibly materialized through reiteration. As Butler observes, that this reiteration is necessary is a sign that materialization is never quite fixed, that bodies never fully comply with the norms by which their materialization is compelled. And it's those constitutive instabilities that afford the possibilities for transformative refiguration. As with sex after Butler, in other words, it should be impossible to think of the binary friend-enemy in any way other than performatively, as the effect of a regulatory ideal and as an essential constituent of what we can call the military imperative. For the soldier, the enemy is not simply out there, but one of the categories by which the soldier becomes viable, that which qualifies him or her within the domain of cultural intelligibility that comprises the military. So if the construction of the enemy is not a singular or determining act, but rather a process of reiteration, we need to reconceive training as itself productive of the entities to be recognized. Seen as another mode of reiteration, simulation is then deeply implicated in performing the realities that it cites. We can then ask, what are the discourses and material practices that hold this contemporary technosphere of trauma together and give it its agency? And with what interventions might we effect its further deconstruction and transformation?